Okay. Yes, so I wanted to start with the reading part, and then I will go to the writing part, because I think the two are very important. So first, you need to know what, well, in order to write a paper, you need to know some literature, right? So you've already read probably lots of papers. If you're doing an MA thesis or a PhD thesis, also you will need a thorough literature review. So it's very important to know how to do it, and to know how to do it quickly, because basically there is probably no time to read all the papers from top to bottom. And it's also not necessary many times, because you probably need just some relevant information, right? And this information, of course, depends on what you're looking for precisely. But usually what we do is we start with some keywords, I suppose, and we look for papers that are on our research topic to see what's already been done on the subject, or to look for some literature, to look for some guidelines, etc., etc. And then these keywords, probably in Google, give us some kind of results, right? And some kind of results appear. Let's see. Yeah, okay. And then we have these papers, and we have to decide which of these papers would be the most relevant for us, or which should we read more thoroughly, and which ones should we just put aside, or just stop at some point. So that's why I wanted to talk about this. But my first question is, what's the basic structure of a research paper? Probably you all know that, but it's just to have a short recap. So maybe, I don't know, I wanted it to be a little bit interactive. So maybe you can just, I don't know, say or write more or less what's the structure of a research paper. What should it have? Which parts can we enumerate? Introduction. Okay, great. So we have an introduction, usually at the beginning. Okay. Then related work, literature review. Okay, this probably goes into an introduction section, which can be named introduction, or some people have introduction that is quite brief, and then they have some kind of a theoretical background, right? Okay, some more, yes, literature review, yes, methodology. Okay, methodology, that's a very important part of a research paper. Then we have results, discussion, conclusions, and references. Great, thank you, Martin, right? Also, someone mentioned research design, right? So research design would go probably into the method section. Background and current state of art would go to the beginning, right? So the introductory part. But basically, you can have different names of each part, right? But usually the method is called method, and results are called results. But some of the other parts can differ, right? So, for example, there are papers that do not really have conclusions. They have like implications for future studies, for example, right? Or they do not have discussion. Usually you should have discussion, but some people name discussion differently somehow. And as I said, introduction is also different. Okay, so we already know that each paper should have more or less a given structure. So if, for example, we're looking for research papers on a given topic we're interested in, what's the first thing we look at, right? So we're Googling, right, by some keyword, and what's the first thing that we open the paper? What do we look at? What's the first thing? Abstract. Okay, so the abstract. Okay, actually, I think the first thing we look at is the title. But of course, if we already open the paper, then we already know the title, right? Or at least part of the title that Google shows, right? So let's say this is the correct thinking, right? Okay, so usually it is like that. We Google for by keyword, and then we find papers, right? A list of papers, and they may be available for reading, or they may not be available. So maybe we can just see the title and abstract and references, for example, it's on a web page, and we can click on the title, right? So first we look at the title, but the title sometimes can be misleading, right? So it's great if the title is very informative and says exactly what we're going to find in the paper, but sometimes it's simply not true. Sometimes it's misleading, and then you read, for example, the paper or the abstract, and it's completely not the thing. And sometimes it's a little bit imprecise, and you want to know exactly what's inside the paper because the title looks great, but maybe it's not exactly what you're looking for. Yeah, so then you look at the abstract, right? And the abstract is, to me, I think, well, the most important part of the paper, right? Because it's a summary of the whole thing. And a well-written abstract should have everything that you actually need to decide whether this paper is relevant for your work or not, right? So just by reading abstracts, you can simply toss around papers and decide, okay, this goes to my list, this does not go to my list. Also, it's important to know which questions can arise when you read an abstract. So this is very, very important. We'll look at that, at how informative an abstract can be. Okay, and here Agnieszka's work will come. Okay, so before we go, because I think the next slide is not about that. I don't remember. I changed the. Yeah, okay, so after the abstract, if we've already read the abstract, let's say we decided that, okay, this work is interesting, I want to know more, right? What do we look at? What would be the next step?
The summary, the results?
Results, results and conclusion. Okay, good. Okay, you can do that, yes. Okay, so it depends a little bit on the focus of what we want, right? So we have the abstract, and the abstract tells us some things, and we look at the results and conclusion, okay. Or we look at the method, right? So there are some people that say method. Well, I would look first at the method, because I want to know more about how the study was conducted. And the abstract is supposed to already tell me what the results were, at least the most important results, right? So basically I have an idea based on the abstract. I have some kind of an idea of what the study gave the authors, right? Maybe I'm not necessarily looking at the conclusions, because the conclusions may not be that informative, but I will go back to that. But I may look at, some results, right? At least some part of the results. Someone says research question and objectives. Yeah. So basically, this is also something interesting. We should also get this from the abstract, at least a general idea, but we want to have more precise or detailed information about that. Okay, so here I listed what I would look at. So some things are in parentheses, because I think they depend, right, on exactly what you want from the paper. But basically, the abstract should give you a general idea of what the aim of the study was, what was done, and what were the results. And now you want to go more profoundly into the paper. So if it was a study, for example, an eye tracking study, you probably want to know exactly about the method and how the results were obtained, because without the method, you cannot know that. You may look at the results, but if you're just skimming the paper for relevant information, then probably you don't want to go into much detail when it comes to the results, because the results sections are quite long and they are very detailed. They contain lots of statistics, and they contain lots of words that can be confusing, especially when we have lots of variables. And this you will see on the based on Agnieszka's paper, that some papers have are very complicated, right? So the studies are complicated. There are many variables. So the results section will have like 10 pages, and each result will be given separately for each dependent variable, right? So then, to get the general idea of the results and interpretation of the results, looking or reading thoroughly the results section is not really very useful, right? The most useful part would be probably the discussion section, which summarizes the results and gives us a general idea about the results, the interpretation, the authors, and maybe will also list some new literature that will help with the interpretation. Maybe it will include some new hypotheses and some proposal for what can be done in the future, right? So this is really nice. But when it comes to results sections, if it's possible, and if the paper has graphic imagery, let's say, so if it has images or graphs or tables, usually they have tables, but of course graphs are even more informative, then this is probably something that will give you an idea about the results better than just trying to look at specific things. Of course, if you're just skimming the paper, if you want to read it from top to down, then of course top to bottom, then of course it's a different story. And I put conclusion in the parentheses because I think most conclusions just summarize or repeat everything that was already said, and probably only summarize the same that was already in the abstract. And maybe they are not necessary to be read. I think results and discussion are more important than conclusion in this sense. And some papers don't really have conclusions because maybe because they are not that useful. The conclusions are in the discussion. So the last part, references, can be very useful because probably you already know that if you read a research paper, usually there is some literature that appears that the authors mention, and it seems that your literature list will grow and grow, right? Because in the references, you will have more literature that would be of interest to you, depending on a given topic or part of the topic that is in the paper and it is discussed, for example, in the introduction, in the theoretical background, or maybe in some other part, maybe in the methodology part, where the authors, for example, explain why they use a given variable or a given method, and cite literature, right? So this is a very useful section. But probably I would say, for me, the most important part would be to read the abstract very well, right, very thoroughly, and decide what else I need. Look at the method, briefly look at the results, look at the discussion, or some parts of the discussion that are interesting to me, and look at the references. That's probably that. So let's maybe take an example. Yeah, I skipped this slide. So this is a paper written by Agnieszka and Olivia Gerber-Moron. And here we can see the first thing that we look at in the paper, which is the title. So let's look at this title. Viewers can keep up with fast subtitles, evidence from eye movement. So on a scale from 1 to 10, how informative is this title, according to you? 10, yes. Agnieszka says 2. Come on, Agnieszka. This title, oh, someone says 5. Okay, so why 5? Why 5? It's a random. Maybe it means I have no opinion, right? I don't know.
Let me just say perhaps that I got a lot of criticism for this title, particularly from people in the subtitling industry, because a number of companies in the industry just read the title of my paper, didn't bother to read anything else, and they thought viewers can cope with any fast subtitles whatsoever. So they would raise the reading speed of subtitles. So that's a dangerous thing to do, okay? So in a way, I have to say that was a sexy title. That was a mistake in a way.
Okay, okay. Well, it's catchy, that's true. The title is catchy, yes. Miroslav is saying that. Sexy, yes, it's sexy also. I think it's, well, okay, so I didn't know that, but I think it's, more or less, it's quite informative. For me, this title tells me a lot about what I can find in the paper. Of course, the title and the titles cannot be too long, right? So you cannot put everything and exclude everything that's not in the paper, and someone might think of it, because people should at least read the abstract, right? To know, to have an idea of what the paper is about. But to me, the title tells me 2 things. First, what methodology was used, right? Evidence from eye movements, which is very informative already. And the title tells me that it will be about testing how people cope or deal with fast subtitles, right? And that they are good at it. Actually, it tells me something about the results. So to me, maybe you have to take into account also the industry and what it might entail. But to me, this title, at least, it tells me what's inside, right? To some extent. So now I will look at the abstract and see whether it's true, right? Because my assumptions may not be correct. Here we have the abstract, and I highlighted some things that I think that are the most important in the abstract. Basically, it's not that the other parts are not important, okay? It's just the things that I think should be there, and they are there, and they are the most informative. So the first two sentences are actually some kind of an introduction, right? So we have people watch subtitled materials with the proliferation. So it makes the abstract nice, right? But it doesn't really provide information, right? It's just an introductory phrase, or actually two phrases. And then we get into actual data that we want to get from the information that we want to extract from this abstract, right? We have some kind of a controversy concerning optimum subtitle speeds. So already in this optimum subtitle speeds, in this phrase, I know that the authors are interested in the speed, in the optimum speed, or how the speed affects viewers, right? And then the authors go on to actually tell me what the study looks into, right? So it looks into whether viewers can keep up, right, with the subtitles, and whether the way they cope with subtitles depends on their familiarity with subtitling, right? So this is an additional question. And I did not highlight that, but we could also highlight this, whether it also depends on their knowledge of the language of the film soundtrack, which is another hypothesis that was tested, right? So I already know that there are three things that will be tested, right? Not one, three, right? So the study already seems a little bit right, robust, right? So I know that it will be important to keep track of these things, right? So subtitle speed and coping with subtitling, depending on familiarity with the whole. So familiarity tells me, okay, familiar with subtitling. This means that I will have several language groups, right? Several groups that differ in by country and the tradition, right? Of whether it's subtitling, dubbing, or whatever industry, voiceover is in I don't know, in Poland. And then language of the film soundtrack would tell me that, okay, they will test more than one language. So probably at least two languages that will be tested. Actually, the authors give me even more information because they give me already some information from the method. They tell me how many people were tested, which language groups, right? And which speeds, 3 speeds that were tested. And also they tell me that there were 2 experiments. So actually it gets more complicated as I read, right? So we have an unknown language, Hungarian, in one experiment, and English, which is a familiar language, supposedly, in experiment 2. So this is what I already know from the abstract. And then we go to the variables that were measured. So now look at the list. Comprehension, self-reported cognitive load, scene and subtitle recognition, preferences and enjoyment. That's a lot, right? So you can already imagine that if you have 3 groups, 2 experiments, 3 speeds, and we measure 5 or 6 different variables, this is a huge study, right? So you can see that it will be, like, for example, the results section will be huge. I don't want to read through all of that, probably, if I'm interested in the gist of the study, right? What else? I would also be interested already by reading, right? I look at viewers' comprehension. Okay, I want to know, how did they measure viewers' comprehension? I can imagine, okay, probably there was a questionnaire they had to fill in after viewing, right? Something like that. But what does it mean, self-reported cognitive load? How can you self-report cognitive load? It probably has to be explained. So this is what I would be looking for in the method section, how this was operationalized, right? Or maybe even earlier on, right? Recognition, preferences, enjoyment. I can assume that these are questionnaires and people have to rate these things. And then we have information about analyzing people's eye gaze. So this is the eye tracking data, and people and the authors tell me about the results, right? So they were able to discover something, which is great, right? They discovered that most viewers could read subtitles as well as follow the images, right? Independent of the speed, right? So even with fast speed. So this is an important result. So it shows us that, it shows us what the title shows us, that if you test viewers on subtitle speed, then even fast speed is good for actually enabling the viewer to understand both the subtitles and the image, right? So the everything that is going on. What raises a little bit of a question for me is most viewers, what does that mean, right? So I assume that not all of the groups will have the same result, right? We had English, Polish, Spanish viewers, and also they, we had 2 experiments, so probably there will be some differential results depending on these variables in terms of this following the images and following what's going on in the video, right? And then the authors explain even further the results, right? So they show, they say that slow subtitles trigger more rereading. Okay, so this is a new result. This is an additional result. We have rereading. That's interesting, especially when it comes to English clips, right? And then it causes frustration and less enjoyment. Interesting. So I would like to look at these correlations that they put in the paper. Faster subtitles were preferred in the case of English. Slower subtitles were preferred in the case of Hungarian videos. Okay, so I'm saying, okay, language familiarity does affect the preference for subtitles, actually, right? Very interesting. And then the last sentence is, the results provide some grounds for revisiting something. This is just, implications of the study. It does not really add anything to how the paper was structured. But you can see that this abstract is very informative. Already after reading it, I know so much about the paper that I know exactly where to go to actually get more information. So it gives me information on the goal of the study, on the hypotheses. Not exactly, I would have to read more thoroughly for that, but in general, I have a general idea about the method and about the experiments that were run, about the variables that were tested, and about the results, right? So I have everything already. So as you can see, maybe we don't have to look at the conclusions if we have such an abstract, right? Of course, not all abstracts are written in a great way, so sometimes they're not that informative, but basically the abstract will already give you a general idea of the study, the most important information of the study, and also ideas about what you want to look at more deeply, right? So if we want to look at it, let's see. This is the paper. So I have the abstract here, and I want to okay, skip the introduction. Probably I don't need the introduction. If I want to go into some details of the variables that they used, or the assumptions, or the hypotheses, then I can go here. For example, look at some literature on subtitle speed and previous research, right? There are subtitles of this section, right? Subsections. The role of film soundtrack also, etc. Experience with subtitling, all the relevant issues. And this paper, as most papers, at the end of the introduction, have the overview of the study, like the main goal and hypotheses, right? So this is the overview. Actually, I highlighted some things here, but actually this was already in the abstract. This doesn't give me that much new information. So this is really great. It gives me different speeds and then the different variables. So if they were not that precisely named in the abstract, then I can look at them here. Then it says that we have different groups, we have different languages, that, for example, videos are dubbed into Hungarian, but originally made in English, right? Because they wanted to control for the content of subtitle translation. This is also important from the point of view of the method. And then we can go to the hypotheses, right? So the hypothesis was, for example, that one of them, higher subtitle speed makes people, increases the cognitive load, right? And this results in more effortful viewing experience, lower comprehension, higher frustration, and less enjoyment. So look at the lots of things, right? And then I want to know about these self-reports. So here I have information actually on the self-reports, right? Difficulty, effort, and frustration. These are the three indicators that the authors used of cognitive load, right? Self-reported. So here I have this missing information that I had from the abstract. Of course, you cannot put everything in the abstract because it's impossible. It has to be short. So here I found this information already. And what else? I can read maybe a little bit about the eye tracking assumptions, right? So because the experiments involve eye tracking. So here we have hypotheses concerning this, right? So if subtitles are fast or too fast, the viewers may spend excessive amount of time in the subtitle area at the cost of on-screen action, right? And this could mean longer mean fixation duration, more fixations, and longer time spent in the subtitle. So we already know that we will look at this in eye tracking, right? And there are some other assumptions, some other hypotheses, right? Recognizing also the hypothesis about rereading, which can also result in confusion, frustration, less enjoyment, etc. And here I think this is not new. Okay. Oh, and hypotheses concerning familiarity with subtitling, right? So people who are familiar with subtitling may have developed certain strategies, right, to process subtitles more efficiently, right? So this is one of the hypotheses, right? Another one. Okay. And I highlighted one more thing, that no work to date has investigated subtitle speeds using such mixed methods approach, right? So this is quite interesting, yeah, because we see that the study is very complicated, but it's complicated for some reason, right? Because these different variables have not been correlated before in any study, right? So they want to do that. And then what we have is the method for the first experiment and the second experiment. So here, if I'm interested in more details, I already know more or less what was done, but I can look at more details, like the number of participants. I already had them, but I can look at the ages. I can look at where they were from, the distribution between the groups. I have nice tables that show me that. I know that they are from the psychology, the UCL psychology poll, and from the social media. I know that they were paid. What about the stimuli? I know that there were 3 clips lasting 46 minutes, right? And then how they were, where they were extracted from. Important for me, how these different variables were divided into conditions, right? So here I know that because there were 3 groups of participants, each one saw a different combination of film plus subtitling speed, right? So here, for example, group 1 saw Blue Jasmine subtitled at 20 characters per second, Inside Out at 16, and Mad Men at 12. Group 2 had different speeds, and group 3 had different speeds, right? So the speeds were different across groups, and the presentation of clips in each group was randomized. This is important, that it was all randomized, right? So this is what I get from here. And then there are some examples of these different speeds and how the subtitles looked. So I can look at the examples. I can look at the procedure, how they were sat down and where and how the experiment was run, apparatus, right, and the sampling speed, and the designs. So we can see a 3x3 mixed ANOVA with subtitle speed as a within subject factor and native language as a between subject factor, right? So this is important for statistics. And dependent variables that are listed here, we have all of them, and we can see that all of them were like, so the results will be separate for each dependent variable. And also I can see that the self-reported cognitive load had 3 variables, but they were not collapsed into one for some reason. They were all measured separately, right? So I know that there will be 3 different statistical tests for each of these self-reported measures of cognitive load, and not for cognitive load in general, right? So this is what I know. And some more information on these particular variables, how they were measured. For example, comprehension was a percentage of correct answers in a multiple choice questionnaire, which looked like this, for example, right? Cognitive load, difficulty, effort, and frustration were assessed on a 1 to 7 scale, right? The same for enjoyment. And then scene recognition would be pairs of screenshots. So the participant had to choose, and they were counterbalanced and so on. So I can take a look at some details, right? So basically, this is the most important part, because you, in order to assess also the results and to understand and interpret the results, you need to know how the study was run exactly. And with so many variables, you would have to probably just take at least a little look at each of them, right? And then we get to results. And as I said, since there are so many variables, I don't know if you want to go through all of them. You may want to look for main effects, right? So for example, in comprehension, subtitle speed does not have an effect on comprehension, but there is a main effect of language in comprehension, right? And then there is some, because we have language, 3 groups, there is some explanation, right? So Polish, Spanish, and English. More details and more details. Cognitive load, you can look at the main effects of the interpretation, at the differences between groups, etc., enjoyment, and so on, right? So you can see that the list is very long. So if you just skim the paper, maybe it's not that important to look at all of this. We can look at the tables that give us general information, but probably I would just go directly to, well, graphs are also quite great to interpret the results, but I want to see what the summary of the results is, right? So, discussion. Contrary to our expectations, subtitle speed did not affect comprehension, scene recognition, or enjoyment, right? So we can already see that the first hypothesis was not confirmed, right? Participants were equally satisfied with the speed in the slow, medium, and fast condition, right? Also, there is something about rereading here, right? So subtitles that were the slowest induced most rereading, right? The highest number of revisits. Highest cognitive load was reported by English participants, right? This is the experiment 1. And I somehow skipped one important thing when it comes to the variables, because there were also these eye tracking measures, and they are well described here also. They're very important. And here revisits are well defined, right? So the number of glances a participant made, the subtitle area of interest after visiting the subtitle for the first time, etc., right? So you can, this is an important part also, but unfortunately is skipped, right? So basically, I'm interested in how the study was run and what's the general result, right? Of course, if you want to read the study thoroughly, then you would have to somehow read everything, because sometimes also it depends on the paper, but sometimes the authors make interpretations that are not necessarily that well aligned with the results that they have, because these are just interpretations, and maybe you would say, okay, but where did they find it? It's not in the results. So sometimes reading the results thoroughly, this is especially important when you're reviewing a paper, right? Is important to then assess the author's interpretation, right? But yeah, that's a different story. And of course, you have experiment 2. Then you have the method, which is quite similar, only that the paradigm is different because it's 2 by 3 ANOVA. Here, mixed ANOVA. Sorry for skipping. Yeah, here. And of course, you can look at the results. You can look at the tables and graphs that are quite nice. And then you can go to the discussion, which shows general effects. Discussion. Similarly to experiment 1, so we see that there is a similarity, and contrary to our predictions, speed has no effect on comprehension. Also, in contrast to the first experiment, more people wanted to have a full version of the dialogue in the subtitles rather than the reduced one. Slower subtitles were found to be more frustrating and less enjoyable. Right? So this is, yeah. And then you can go, for example, to the general discussion section, where the authors revisit their hypotheses about each of the things, right? The subtitle speed, then the impact of the soundtrack, right? And the experience with subtitling, right? And then conclusion, which actually only repeats what was already there, right? So basically, this is very important to actually look at. It's very important to look at the discussion, and here we have also some implications for the future and so on. So basically, I would say that this paper is very informative. It is also very complicated, and we already know this from the abstract. So if you want to get the gist of the paper, it's good to just take a quick look at all the areas of interest in the paper, right? So whatever draws your attention in the abstract and whatever is unclear, it's good to look at it in the paper, right? So for me, it was unclear how cognitive load was, for example, measured. It was not so clear how, for example, all these variables were tested, right, et cetera, et cetera. So, right, I needed this information, but basically this abstract gave me basically a lot, right? I wouldn't say that it was not informative. It was very informative. Let's take a look at a different one. So here we have, we will not look at the whole paper. We just look at the abstract just to compare and to see which questions it raises, right? So here in media psychology, a paper called The Cognitive Effectiveness of Subtitle Processing. Okay, so how informative is this title to you? What would you say? Cognitive effectiveness of subtitle processing. A bit abstract. Yes. What's the cognitive effectiveness? It seems like, yeah, exactly. The first question would be, what is that, right? What's cognitive? It sounds nice, sounds great. Of course, if I'm a researcher and I already know literature on cognitive effectiveness, and I'm precisely looking for cognitive effectiveness, then I will know what this means, probably, right? But if I'm not, then I would say, okay, cognitive effectiveness, how is it measured? What does it mean exactly? What does it refer to, right? So then I look at the abstract and see whether they explain it somehow. So the abstract is like this. We analyzed the cognitive processing of a subtitled film. Okay, this doesn't tell me much, so it doesn't prove, but there. They use an integration of a variety of measures, eye movement data, word recognition, and visual scene recognition. Okay, so I have already some precise information on what they are using with measures, which is good. And they are testing a hypothesis, right? A hypothesis that sounds like this. the hypothesis is about cognitive effectiveness, which is exactly the thing from the title. And here it is explained, right? It leads to a good understanding of film content without a significant trade-off between image processing and text processing. So here I already know, okay, cognitive effectiveness of subtitle processing means that I can easily understand the film or the content without a trade-off, right? A significant trade-off between, so switching between the image and the text and losing information, right? So basically, this is what it says. Great, I already know that from the abstract. Okay, and then there is another hypothesis. Two-line subtitles whose segmentation is syntactically incoherent can have a disruptive effect on processing, right? So another, so I know that two hypotheses will be tested in this paper. And then results. The results highlight the effectiveness. So this means that the hypothesis is confirmed, right? That subtitle processing is effective, right? And regardless of the quality of line segmentation, participants had a good understanding of the film, right? They achieved good levels of performance, and no trade-off was noted, right? So basically, they confirmed that this hypothesis about the effectiveness of cognitive processing in subtitles. And then there is this fragment, right? Eye movement analysis enabled a further characterization of cognitive processing during subtitle film viewing. Well, I don't know if this sentence adds any relevant information, right? This article discusses the theoretical implications. Well, this is something that I would say, okay, each article probably should discuss the theoretical implications of the results, right? So why do you write about that? And then the findings, I don't know, and multiple source communication highlights their methodological and applied implications. Well, I don't know. I would probably skip this part, the whole fragment, and instead of that, write something about the method of the study, because I don't know anything about the method. I don't know how many groups of participants there were, how many participants, I don't know. I have no idea how exactly the study was set up, right? So maybe these 5 lines could be converted into something more informative from my point of view, right? Because here I don't know. Of course, you can write something at the end that, you know, your results were great, right? Have applied implications, methodological implications, but maybe it should be just one short sentence. So this is the abstract. It gives me some information, but of course I would have to now look in the paper, right? Go here, for example, and precisely go to the section, skip the introduction, of course, and go to the method section. I can also read more profoundly on the cognitive effectiveness, right? Because they discuss it. So that would be from the intro section if I wanted to look at it. But basically, what I would be interested in is how the study was run. What was the study about, right? Quality method. Yeah, so I go to the method, and I have 41 undergraduates and postgraduates, Italian native speakers. I know it's Italian, right? And the language used was Hungarian in the experiment, and they used subtitles. And here I have the design, right? So the dependent variables were measures of performance on word recognition and scene recognition. And also they had something about eye tracking, right? But then if I read more and more, they had eye tracking data. It's extracted only from a subset of participants, etc., right? So I would have to go here to actually get more data on how the experiment was run. I have some interesting images that show me exactly what the participants saw on the screen, etc. So great. And I have information on the questionnaires, right, that were also used to measure this cognitive effectiveness, right? Okay, and then I can look at the procedure and the results and the discussion. So basically, this abstract was a little bit less informative, let's say, because it gave me some information, but there was the information about the method was completely missing, right? So I had to read between the lines and make assumptions and then look in the method section. Okay, and the third example would be a study with a very elusive title, using eye movements to study the reading of subtitles in video. So what does that title tell you? Is it informative? Is it not informative? What would you say?
Well, everybody's afraid to say anything. Maybe Jan-Louis will be watching this after that, so.
A true 5, okay, a true 5. It's informative. Okay, to some people it's informative, to some people it's not so much informative. Okay, yeah, of course it's also a bit subjective, and it depends on also on the subdiscipline you're in, right, and on your familiarity with this paper or these authors, or you know what they do, etc. So of course it all depends. But to me the title is a bit weird, because it would suggest that it's not a study, it's more of a methodological paper or something like that, using eye movements to study this. So I would think that this is either a review paper or a methodological paper, something like that, right? Because it's very general and it doesn't say that this particular study is about something, because many studies are about reading subtitles. The 2 previous studies were about that, right? So and in video, right, the same. So it's not very, for me, it's like, well, I need to read the paper to know. Okay, so let's look at the abstract. What do they say? This article reports the first, and this is a great sentence, really. The first eye movement experiment to examine how the presence versus absence of concurrent video content and presentation speed affect the reading of subtitles. So to me, it's like, why is it the first experiment to examine that? We've just seen an experiment that was about, for example, presentation speed, and was published 2 years earlier, right? The article about by Agnieszka. So
yeah, let me jump in here. It says presence versus absence of videos. So what they also tested were videos, black videos with subtitles only, but with no video content. So that was the first one, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So, but it was, to tell you the truth, when I read the abstract, I had no idea that they were manipulating the video. I don't know why, but this sentence is formulated in such a way that I was like, presence versus absence of concurrent video content. What does that mean? So basically, I had to go into the paper to see that they were basically giving just subtitles with a blank screen, or a black screen actually, or video with subtitles. But it was not clear to me. But maybe it was it's clear to the participants of our workshop, right? But to me, it was not. So for me, this sentence was.
I think it's clear after yesterday's talk by Jan-Louis, who presented the study. So.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, since because yesterday I think I couldn't attend that. So yeah. So basically, for me, this sentence was a little bit confusing. I would look into that. Okay. Yeah, Sonia says it wasn't clear to her either. Yeah, okay. So it's about the formulation of the sentence more than about the content, right? So for me, the combination of this first experiment, the speed and this presence absence, I just didn't know what that was about, and I decided that I need to look into the paper to see what exactly they meant by that. Okay, results indicated that participants adapted their visual routines to examine video content while simultaneously prioritizing the reading of subtitles. That's a very interesting result, right? It also raises some questions, right? Because we see that there are some visual routines, and then the first question is, okay, what are these visual routines and what do they depend on? right? So probably the authors define some visual routines or identify visual routines in the control condition, let's say, and these visual routines are adapted in the experimental condition, let's say. That might be the case, right? Very interesting, a very interesting thing. Of course, it's measured with eye tracking, right? So there is some kind of a visual routine of how the eye gaze goes, right? Okay, and prioritizing reading of subtitles. That's also interesting and worth looking into, right? So this is the gist of the results, but probably needs a little bit more of an explanation, especially when the latter was displayed only briefly. So here we know, for example, from this information, we know that they were manipulating the speed of what they say that presentation speed earlier on. Basically, they were manipulating that. Although decisions about when and where to move the eyes largely remained under local cognitive control, this was also modulated by global task demands, suggesting an integration of local and global eye movement control. Okay, so this is very complicated. For this, I would need to look into the paper because I have I can have a general idea about local and global cognitive control or task demands, etc. But how they operationalized it in the study and how they got these results and interpreted the results in terms of cognitive control and locality and globality, I would have to read the discussion section probably. Maybe they also have something in the intro about that, right? So, and then they say theoretical and pedagogical implications are discussed, and we also briefly described, well, I don't know, I would probably phrase it differently. I wouldn't say that. The most important part of this sentence is that they have a new framework, right? So I would say that based on these results, we discuss a new theoretical, or we present a new theoretical framework, right, for multimodal reading, which is kind of cool. So the study looks very interesting, but it is a little bit enigmatic based on the abstract. So I just wanted to give you a brief overview of 3 abstracts of interesting studies that are completely different. Of course, each study is different, each abstract will be different, but basically, based on the abstract, you already have some questions that you have about the paper, and you want to answer, right? So you want to look into specific parts of the paper to answer them, and you also have certain information, especially about the goal and results of the study, that should be there in the abstract. If not, then the abstract is not good, right? But these abstracts give you general results, and these abstracts, all 3 of them, gave you some idea about what was manipulated, the variables, and the goal of the study, which is quite interesting. And all of them explained the title to some extent, at least, even if the title was not that informative, or maybe was a bit confusing.
May I add something?
Yes.
I just want to say that before writing my abstract and my paper, I attended a workshop on how to write competitive abstracts. So that might have helped a bit.
Your abstract,
well.
to me, your abstract was great. Like there was nothing missing, I think.
Yeah. I'm not like fishing for compliments here or anything. Just I wanted to say that it also depends on the requirements of the journal, right? Some journals are very specific what they want in each sentence. So I suppose that might have an impact as well.
Yes, and also some more restrictive as to the length, and some give you only 150 words or even 100 words, and it's impossible to put anything in 100 words. So basically, then you have to cut things, and sometimes things become ungrammatical once you cut things because you want to put more information into the abstract. So yeah, so it's also a variable to take into account. But in general, I hope you saw at least that what I wanted to show you, that in the abstract you already have all the information you need to decide whether the paper will be of interest to you, or whether to just take a quick look into the paper and see whether this is something that you can add to your research. And then you skim the paper, and after that you can add it to your library and then read it when you have more time to have a more thorough read. Because well, this is probably how the most effective way of doing a literature review, especially if you're writing a paper or writing a thesis or something. When I wrote my PhD thesis, I remember that it was really terrible because I read everything that I had, practically all the literature 3 times, and it's useless to do that this way. So I learned my lesson, and now I don't do that. I just collect papers by abstracts and some skimming the content, and don't read them as thoroughly the first time, because then once I get to writing something, I will have to read them more thoroughly. So basically, this is probably the best idea to do it a little bit more efficiently, especially that we need a lot of literature review before we get to any study right now, because there has been so much research on every topic that we need to have this literature review, because maybe someone just did what we did. So what we want to do, then we don't want to repeat the same. Maybe you want to change something in our paper. Maybe you want to do a replication study. It's good to know what's already there. Okay, so this is about the abstract. And just briefly to tell you, I think this reading part is already very informative about what should be there in the studies. But basically, there are some reporting, standards in eye tracking research. Well, the standards are actually lacking, but there is a nice publication uploaded in 2020 in Psych Archive that gathered 215 eye tracking papers from published between 2007 and 2017. And basically, they enumerated or listed all of the items reported in these papers, and then took experts to decide on which of these items are really, really necessary and should be always reported in any eye tracking research paper. And there were 31 items, but they saw that basically from these 215 eye tracking papers, no one reported all of them, and 70% reported less than 50% of these items. So you can see that we need standardization, and we need some specific guidelines on what to do. And they give these guidelines step by step. Probably the most important thing that we already saw in these abstracts, right, in these papers, is to state auxiliary assumptions about the underlying processes of dependent variables. So basically, what are these auxiliary assumptions? Whenever we measure something with eye tracking, it's not a direct measure of anything. It's let's say it's somehow has to be linked with the cognitive process behind it, or with some kind of a result that we hypothesize about, right, or process. So we need to state that. For example, we had this cognitive effectiveness or whatever, right? What does that mean? They do explain it in the paper, right? It's very important to do that, right? We have cognitive load. We need to explain what that means. If it's self-reported cognitive load, we need to explain how we measure it and why, and so on and so on, right? So this is very important. And when it comes to the methods, of course, it's very important to report on the apparatus that you use, because of reproducibility, right? So you need to state the model, the producer, the type, everything that is relevant for future studies, because this hugely affects the results and how the results are reported, and the analysis of the results, right? Also, very important, the monitor, right? And the resolution and size that can affect the AOIs, right? So this can affect the distance between the AOIs, the size of the AOIs, and the distance between the participant and the AOIs, right? So how far is the participant's eye from the monitor, right? This can also differ across studies, and we have to take this into account if we want to replicate something or use the same methodology as someone else. And of course, we need to describe the software, because software also affects the results and affects data, even raw data in many cases. The presentation of the stimuli, but also software to use to pre-process the data and then to do statistical analysis. So the more precise you are about what you did, the better, right? Then the materials. especially the AOIs, they have to be very precisely stated, right? Where they are on the screen, how they are defined, right? What's their absolute size and relative size, right? What is the minimal distance between them, whether they overlap and how. Also, the stimuli have to be very well described, the method of their preparation, and also if you do pupil dilation, then luminescence, if it's matched between the stimuli and ambient lighting, right? And procedure. Of course, you have to say what the setup was. Very important was the interstimulus interval, whether you are presenting a fixation cross, for how long are the stimuli presented, whether the participant is free to decide whether he goes on, or he or she goes on or not, or whether there is a fixed time of exposure to a stimulus. What's the number of trials, right, and etc., and how the data are collected exactly. And as for the results, a very important question is the data quality and how many data points were actually lost, right, were excluded from the data for some reason. This has to be very precisely stated, because sometimes people just exclude half of the data and they don't report it, and it's not a valid experiment in this case, right? Of course, there is always some kind of a threshold that you have to set to be transparent, to exclude data that are not of good quality, right? And you have to state the reasons why. As for the dependent measures, it's very important to state the aggregation methods for fixations, but also for pupil dilation and for other measurements, and all the transformations of the data that you've done. And as for the discussion, always include limitations to the study, right? Limitations concerning the design, concerning the variables that you use, or variables that you use as proxies for some cognitive processes, and limitations related to the eye tracking methodology, right? And something that I really encourage you to do, they actually taught me on one of my foreign scholarships, so I'm really grateful to the people who taught me that, psychologists, basically. It's really good to have an experiment book, which lists everything that you've been doing from the very beginning, from the idea to the implementation of your idea, from idea through the design of the study, references, all the hypotheses, research questions, and implications that you would, and expected results, etc., to be very transparent and to share with your colleagues if you, for example, work with people on a given project. I can give you just a short example of a study that is not an eye tracking study, but my experiment book from an EEG experiment. But it proved to be very, very useful when because the process from getting the idea to actually writing the paper about it was almost 2 years, right? My first idea, then I had to apply, I got a scholarship, right, etc. But from the first attempts at designing the study with the people that I worked with to writing the paper, it was more than 1 year. Well, it was 1 year and 1 month, something like that. So basically, you don't remember everything that you did, your data manipulations, your changes of decision concerning the design, concerning the expected results, the hypotheses, etc. It's really difficult to keep track of all of that. So the more you write down, the better, right? And then you can keep version control also, right? So basically, this is a study on stress perception. It's not really relevant, but basically, you can start with an introduction that says what the goal of the study is, and then you use it in the introduction of the paper, right, that you will be writing. You list references that you can add during the process of designing the study, preparing the study, running the study, then analyzing the results, etc., information about the authors, and also, I'll skip this because it's repeated. Yeah, concept and procedure, for example. So here is my first general description of the concept and procedure, but then I have more precise information on the method. But here I can put whatever I found in the literature, and I can then put it in the actual paper that I was writing. Stages and timeline, very important to give yourself deadlines, and if you have a team to know which part ends where and who does it, etc., etc. And then the paradigm that you're going to be using, the conditions that will be tested, the variables, the stimuli, and how you're going to prepare it, etc., etc. Very important. The duration of the task. You can make a first estimation or a final estimation, even how many blocks, whether they are randomized, which software you will be using, how will you code the experiment. All of this is very important. And then, yes, experiment coding and procedure, which system you use, how you do that. You can put it all here. And a very important part, I think, is the part of predictions, so potential outcomes. Whenever you have a hypothesis, you need to know beforehand, right, to be scientific, right? So for the study to be really scientific, you need to know beforehand what the expected results are, what hypotheses you have, so that you don't fall into making additional hypotheses or hypothesizing after running the study, which is not the correct way to go. Right, so the best way is to just decide what effect. So if you have a hypothesis, you can have the effect or not. If the hypothesis is confirmed, what does that mean for your theory? What does that mean for your research question? If it's not confirmed, also what does that mean? If you have different conditions and they can cross, right? If you have interactions between conditions, what would that mean? For example, if I had a 2x2 design, right? So I had 4 different outcomes. I had to think about what each of the outcomes would mean for me and how I would interpret it. Of course, the study can lead to additional questions, to some additional results and relations between the variables. And that's, of course, something you will do once you have the results. But it's really good to have the expected results, the potential outcomes, and their interpretation beforehand, so that you and also your team understand what you're doing and why and what you expect, right? So everything is written down there, and stimuli, the criteria for choosing the stimuli, etc., names of the stimuli and some parameters, etc. So this is, for example, my experiment book, and I recommend it, because then I could for example, I ran the study. It took me a long time to find the stimuli. I had to change the criteria several times. I had to negotiate between different co-authors, etc., etc. And then I didn't really remember exactly what I did, right? And I had it written down, and it really helped me, because then I had to put it in the paper. So basically, this is something I really recommend to you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think it's almost my time. So basically, I wanted you to maybe do some work of your own, but there's not that much time. But if you want to, you can do this thought experiment, or maybe this literature review on your own in your free time. Next time you look at some literature, maybe for your topics, even the topics that you already designed and all that stuff, right? It's good to choose a topic, look at whatever you find, and have a brief review of the titles plus abstracts and see what is relevant for you. Also, you want to have papers that are similar to your study, or that you want to use as model studies, let's say, that you will use to maybe put things in your paper, right? How to describe this, how to describe that. It's good to base your report on other reports. So maybe you can do this experiment and see if it works for you. If just like, quick skimming of the content of the papers helps you in your literature review for the next project, or for the project that you're working on right now. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Karolina.
And I hope it helps or helped someone and will help. So I hope it is useful. and you will have some fun with literature review next time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Really interesting. You have definitely inspired me to tell, well, not only myself to start this practice, but also for all the PhD students to have their experiment books or lab books, as we call them here. Yes, so well done. Is there a question or comment, perhaps? Because I was hoping we could take a 5-minute break before Anya's talk. We have a question: what's the best practice for literature coverage? Shall we consider the previous 4 or 5 years of literature, or any ideas? How far back should you go? I guess that's the question.
Well, I don't know. I don't have a time limit. I don't think it's. Of course, the more relevant, the more topical, right? The newest, the better. But sometimes there are some classical works that you could simply not see because you were only looking at the newest papers. And of course, you can find them in the references probably of good papers that are quite new. So that's a good thing. But usually I go by a topic relevance rather than a year of publication. But of course, I see, for example, if I find several papers and they are contradictory on some points, and one of them is very old, then I would say, okay, there is new methodology, there are new. I would take that into consideration.